What's going on, everybody? It's Matt, aka the Lumberjack Landlord, and we actually have a real deal lumberjack with us today. And so this is Matt Peterson, everybody, from Mountainside Land Development. And the reason that I wanted to bring Matt on the show today, aside from him having my name or my having his name, and my being a fake lumberjack and him being a real lumberjack, is I wanted to have him on to talk to folks about land. So Matt is a landlord, long-term, short-term rental, and land. But I wanted to have him kind of introduce yourself if you could, Matt, and just kind of tell everybody who you are. And then I got a whole bunch of questions racking around up here that I want to ask you, because I only have long-term rentals and I'm realizing how boring I am. So Matt, if you could introduce yourself to everybody, please.
All right. Well, I'm Matt Peterson. I grew up in the sticks of North Florida, South Georgia, on a farm, and kind of started my real estate venture back in 2000, 2001 time period. My grandfather was into land, and he was in the pine tree business. So back in like the 1930s, 1940s, he had large tracts of land with pine, and he would be in the turpentine business, and they'd get turpentine from the pine trees. They'd log the pine trees, they'd drive them to the mill, and that kind of stuff. As I got a little, older in my 20s, mid to late 20s, my parents always told me, you need to buy land, you need to buy land. And I just thought, I don't want to wait 30 and 40 years for a pine tree to grow to kind of recoup my money. So I went to school and I studied entomology, which is a study of insects and agriculture. One of the reasons I picked entomology was because I saw like the bark beetle issues that my parents had on their timber, and other insect issues with crops and things like that. So I studied entomology thinking I was going to go into some kind of agriculture, and I ended up working for pest control. The money was in pest control business. So I worked for Terminex, the big termite company, and then I worked for Orkin for 20 years as their entomologist. So in the time I was in the W-2 role, with Orkin, I, dabbled in real estate, and I started with long-term rentals back in 2000 down in South Florida. I got way over leveraged, unfortunately in 2005, 2006 down in South Florida. Almost had to declare bankruptcy from all the leverage I had taken on, thinking I was going to be the next, real estate mogul, and just, we all know what happened in 2008, 2009 time period. So I learned a lot of valuable lessons with that. I was so sick of real estate after the crash and almost losing, having foreclosures, deed in lieu of foreclosures, everything else, on my record at 7-year hit on credit and everything. I kind of got to the point where I didn't want to touch anything real estate, for a while. I started dabbling again in real estate in 2015, 2014 time period, a few years later, just because I've always had that real estate bug, and enjoyed it. And I've been going to a town in Tennessee since the 1970s called Gatlinburg. It's a real touristy town in the Smoky Mountains. I took my kids there one weekend, and I paid, I think, $1,500 for a little 2-bedroom cabin for 3 nights.
Wow.
Pulled the listing up on Zillow, saw the guy paid like $125 for it. I was thinking, with my long-term rental background, I was thinking, man, I just paid this guy's mortgage for like 2 months at least. So 2018, roughly 2019, I started really researching short-term rentals. Bought quite a few in Pigeon Forge area, Gatlinburg, Tennessee area. And, having the background of long-term rentals, and then I had some short-term rentals, the short-term for me just cash flowed significantly. I had probably 60 to 80% cash on cash returns on my short-term.
Whoa.
So I really scaled hard and fast with short-term rentals. And in the process, I was raking in so much cash with short-term rentals. I had that little voice in the back of my head from my parents, buy land, buy land, buy land. So, I love the Smoky Mountains. I love the Rocky Mountains, any kind of mountain scenery, it's just, close to my heart. So I started acquiring land in the Smoky Mountains of Tennessee, probably about 3 to 4 years ago. And what happened is I bought one tract of 200 acres
Mhm.
that a guy, an older gentleman, was just looking to get out of, and I took it off his hands. So once I bought that, I started really focusing on tracts around that 200 acres.
Sure.
And a lot of, especially Tennessee, I'm sure up in your neck of the woods, and in these more rural areas, a lot of this land has been in families
Yeah.
for hundreds of years,
Yeah.
sometimes, 100 to 200 years. So what I did strategically was kind of just start getting to know the people around the land that I bought. I'd look up the tracts surrounding my land, find out the
Sure.
last names. I'd go up to my land, see people, at their house, stop and introduce myself, and just build a relationship.
Yeah.
And then I plant the seed. Hey, if you ever want to get rid of your land, call me. And it really snowballed, and now I'm up to, a couple thousand acres, in
Whew.
that area. And in fact, I'm closing a deal next week for, quite a big portion as well. So that's kind of how my segue from long-term rentals to W-2 to short-term rentals into land.
That's awesome. And so I only have 1.3 million questions, so you might want to let your wife know it's going to be a while. But I think my first question is, having had the experience of the long term, then kind of going through the 07, 08
Mhm,
correction, everybody,
mhm.
now, all of us guys that went through that,
Yeah,
we all made sure to delever, right? We're not
100%.
zero
Yeah.
leverage, but we're much lower
Right,
leverage. And so it's
right.
kind of like, I only need my business to really run it like 30 or 35%, and I'm still
Mhm.
okay. Right.
Yeah.
So that's kind
Yep.
of the area that most of us kind of delevered to.
Mhm.
But one of the interesting things is for me, it really showed me the game of better understanding long-term rental so I could then do
Mhm.
more of that. So you did something really cool, which was pivot, as you were talking about, kind of into the land. Um, one of the things that we really try and do on this channel is really try and help people understand the perspective. We like to learn
Mhm.
from people that are doing. And so when you look at, so you kind of had that bug, you're saying, hey, I can get a hold of this 200 acres and that's pretty cool.
Mhm.
Um, I don't know what raw acreage goes for in your area, but raw acreage for me is anywhere from, you know, $500 an acre to probably like 3,000 an acre,
Mhm.
4,000 an acre
Mhm.
is kind of where it runs where I am. But when you look at a piece of land, what are kind of the three things that you're looking for in that piece of land that say, this is a piece of land worth owning? Because we'd love to all have $1 million or $2 million or
Right.
$3 million to park somewhere and say,
Yeah.
I own that land, but
Right.
you've got to produce some sort of income and revenue off of
Absolutely. So
it.
you have to be careful too, because if it's been held in the family a long time, the pretty much every parcel I've purchased, the person that has sold it to me at this point is in their 80s and 90s. So
Yeah.
they're extremely, old, they're older people. A lot of times I've had the children have to sign off. The parcel I'm closing next week has 26 people on the title. Um,
Holy
yeah,
Toledo.
so you have to, work through all that kind of stuff. And what happened, it's been in the family forever. This person passed away, there's no will, so it goes to this person and then the kid grandkids. And when you close on a deal like that, you have to get 26 signatures. The realtor I use for the land acquisition, some of the signatures were even gathered by mail away. The people didn't have computers, so you had to mail away to the signature, wait on it to get back. So there's a lot of intricacies. It's a lot different from buying big pieces of land than buying, a residential house or,
Sure.
a duplex or
Sure.
something like that.
How long
Um,
does a deal like that typically take you to put together?
so a lot of the land deals, I try to do cash deals,
Yep.
just because if I show up at the person's house with a check and say, how much do you want? They're much more likely, even if it's not on the market, they're much more likely, if I've got the relationships established,
Sure.
say I own this chunk and I want this chunk, this chunk, and this chunk, I'll just go talk to them, or I'll talk to somebody I've met, say, hey, do you know this so and so? Oh yeah, they've lived there for 70 years. Well, can you introduce me to them?
Yeah.
And sometimes I'll plant the seed on maybe visit one, and then visit two or three. I'll be like, look, I got my checkbook on me. I'll buy your land. If you want to sell it, and when you do want to sell it, let me know. One of the three of the things I look for, or a couple of things I look for, has the land ever been logged? One of the things that produces income on land, and what I learned from my parents, in Florida, it's pine trees, slash pines, loblolly pines, things like that. So with the pine trees, it produces two sources of income with pine. As I was younger, I remember my parents would hire companies, or companies would actually call them and say, hey, can we rake your pine straw? So the pines would be 10, 15 years old, but they would be mature enough, producing pine straw every year. And you'd have companies come down, rake in between the rows of pines, and then bale it up. And Home Depot, Lowe's, places like that would buy it, or big pine straw outfits would buy it. So you can rake the pine trees twice a year. And then at about the 30 to 35 year mark is when it gets time to thin it out and cut some of it, things like that. So I always look for land that has not been logged. If it's been clear cut and logged, unless you're, so I develop, so I look for, good tracks with views and things like that are easy to develop kind of land for me and to build places on. But the first thing, if I'm going to sit on the piece of land for a while before I develop it, I want it to produce a little bit of income for me,
Sure.
and two of the ways in mountain land or any kind of hilly land you can produce income is by logging the trees or by the rock that's on the land. So some of the Smoky Mountains, I mean, it's massive stone is, the mountain's made out of stone for the most part, stone and dirt. So you have companies like big rock yards and big rock companies that will come up from Florida, from other areas down, and I'm speaking specifically for the Southeast,
Sure.
but you get these big companies that want big landscaping rocks outside of the, big communities. Like if you've ever seen the landscaping entrance to some of the communities down in South Florida, you have these big waterfall kind of features for new developments and things. So that rock comes from somewhere, and generally it's from somebody like me, or somebody like my land, So they'll bring all their equipment up, they'll rock it, I call it, but they'll pull the rocks out. They look for the flat kind of rocks. They look for the big boulder type rocks, but there's really good money in rocking the land or de-rocking the land. And then on top of that, you have different species of trees that are very, very in demand. With the logs, and I'm not too familiar with like what's in New Hampshire, and things like that.
Mostly pine and hardwoods.
Okay.
Mostly
Okay.
pine and hardwood. So we're looking at a lot of pine, lots of forest of pine, and then maple. We got a good amount of maple too, because we're kind of close to Canada, only a few hours away from the Canadian maple leaves.
Right.
And so there's lots of lots of pine and there's a lot of maple too, but
Okay.
mostly pine where I'm at.
Okay. All right. Which is a good thing. I look at pine trees. So pine doesn't grow well in the Smokies where I'm at, up on the mountain, right? It's just not a good environment for it. I mean, you have pine trees, but it's just not, it's not like the flat acreage of Florida where companies like Weyerhaeuser and International Paper come in and just can plant thousands of acres in straight lines of pine trees, So, but pine, if in your area, it's great, because I always look at what my parents would do is when they would rake the straw, I looked at it like a security or a stock in the stock market that was paying dividends.
Yeah.
While the pine trees are growing, that pine straw income was just kind of like their dividend income, and they would get quite a bit of money twice a year from the pine trees.
When we talk about pine straw, are you talking about pine needles?
Yeah, that's around land. Like, you have down in Florida, you have mulch around people's homes and flower beds. In Georgia, where I live in Atlanta now, in Georgia, there's just every bed and every neighborhood has pine straw. South Carolina, pine straw, Tennessee, pine straw. So if you go to Home Depot and Lowe's, there's just tractor trailer loads sitting out in their parking lot full of bales of pine straw. And that's what people use to put around their flower bed.
Here we use mulch.
Okay.
We use mulch up here and the pine straw, we actually have to pull out of the beds. We're just wow. Yeah, they literally pull it, and because it's so invasive. And it's funny, to your point, it's a couple times a year, and we're like, man, you got to do this at the beginning of season and at the end of the season too.
Yeah. So in Florida, they have most places or homes, that I was around were mulch as well. And you didn't see a whole lot of pine straw. When I moved to Atlanta, is when I was like, man, everybody's got pine straw around their beds here. And then South Carolina, Tennessee, like there's about 5 or 6 states that around every house in the flower beds and, up against the house, it's nothing but pine straw.
So one of the things, so New Hampshire is known as the granite state.
Mm-hmm.
We have granite
Wow.
in spades. Everything is granite. And so the
Wow.
big thing around here is development here is really hard because you can run into ledge super fast. And everyone's like, I thought I was going to get 14 lots. Now I'm getting 4.
Right.
Right. And so that makes the land super, super expensive, or that makes the lots super expensive.
Yeah. Yeah.
From a land perspective, when you show up and you're looking at a piece of land, what is that thing that you look for where you're like, holy cow, I hope it has X?
So for me, since I build, residential cabins and short-term rentals, I look for, just because I'm a developer now, I've moved in, I look for views, that's what I'm specifically focusing on is like, okay, long-term, can I develop this piece of land, put, 200 or 300 cabins on it, and they all have spectacular views. But that's kind of my long-term vision for a piece before I buy it. While I'm sitting on the land, I'm looking for, okay, are there good, mature, straight trees? One thing, it all depends on the number of cords that a logging company can get out of a tree. Some trees might be gigantic, but if they're really curvy and things like that and twisted, they don't bring a lot of money. The big straight trees look good. One of the things I always do before I purchase those, I get a hold of a forester. I've got a guy that I use, and he'll go walk the land with me before I close on it or before I even sign a contract on it. And he'll tell me roughly, okay, you got about X amount of dollars in loggable timber on this land. And then potential of this species down in the Southeast. White oak is really popular.
Okay.
And I've had a couple of companies, like there's a company, Independent Stave company, has come out to my land. They make all the barrels for Jose Cuervo, Jim Beam, Maker's Mark. So all your whiskey barrels are made out of white oak. So if you find a piece with white oak, you can make a killing. Sometimes $4,000 to $7,000 a tree if it's a really big, mature white oak. You can make a killing on that kind of stuff.
So is that so white oak, is there something where, so like from a rock perspective, up here, it's boring. It's granite and ledge.
Yeah.
That's usually what you're going to find.
Yeah.
And not any of this granite is used. So the small boulders, much like what you were talking about, as far as like field stone. So up here in the Northeast, we have a ton of field stone.
Right.
And a lot of, property lines are shown with that field stone. And it's like, I can only imagine those guys like hooking up horses to those boulders.
Oh yeah.
Moving those boulders to create their lot lines.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I'm always curious about is, because again, just learning this for me, I'm looking, like you said, for a view of the mountains. I'm also looking for rivers and streams.
Right.
Lakes are really hard because I think lakes have been developed for 50 and 100 years up here.
Yep.
But the streams really haven't been. The rivers and the streams really haven't been. And that's becoming more and more difficult up here to build around. You kind of got to be 250 feet off the line before you can just build like what you would normally build.
Yeah.
Because of like EPA and things like that. So do you see, is that trend down there where people are, view, do you consider like river a part of a view?
So with my views, I look for mountain views, but one of the big requests for vacationers to Pigeon Forge, Gatlinburg, Smoky Mountains areas are views of a creek. I have one development I'm doing. It's a small 5-acre development, but it's right across from an extremely large kind of river or creek. And we're starting to develop it, though. We had to get a lot of red tape. We're putting in the stormwater drain system, next week, where the county had to come out, like the county stormwater director had to come out, and just a lot of regulations and criteria for that. But if you found a good piece next to a creek, especially have timber on it, that's prime land. If it
Yeah.
doesn't have timber on it, if you're going to build on it eventually, it's still a piece of prime land. But you have to understand you're going to have to sit on that land.
So you hit it out of the park with something like a white oak or something like that.
Mhm,
But when you're looking at just like common acreage, right? And you've
mhm.
got, because in New Hampshire, you can buy a 50 or 100 or 150 acre piece of land,
Mhm.
and largely that's going to have pine on it. It's going to
Right.
be pine.
Yeah.
One of the things that was really funny is that everyone's heard of Vermont maple syrup, but
Mhm.
most people don't know that we border Vermont. We have New Hampshire maple syrup.
Oh, wow. Wow.
And that stuff, one of the biggest heists in all of history, was a heist of maple syrup,
Oh, wow.
because I think it's for an ounce. It's like $3 for
Mhm.
an ounce. And so they put the in barrels, 55-gallon barrels, just like you do gas.
Mhm.
Well, if you figure for one fluid ounce, it's $3. A barrel is a whole lot of dough.
Oh, yeah. That's
And
crazy.
so they had this, so that's a big thing in just across the border as well in Canada,
Yeah. Yeah.
is they barrel that stuff and then they sell it.
Yeah.
And so one of the biggest heists ever was the heist of their maple syrup
Interesting.
barrels. And
Wow.
so have you done anything outside of um basically like just having it logged or having it rocked? Are those really the kind of two main things
Those
you're
are the
looking at?
two, yeah, those are the two main money makers on land, is the logging of it and the, selling the rock. And again, white oak is not the only species that, like on land in the Southeast, like most of my land has white oak, poplar, a few maple scattered throughout, so what I look for, I've gone through a couple of different loggers, and I finally settled on one. The logger that I chose to log my land, and I don't do, when I log it, I don't clear cut it, unless I'm immediately developing it and I don't want any trees or anything like that. I usually don't clear cut it. I'll do what they call selective logging,
Okay.
where the forester or the forestry consultant will come in and he'll say, okay, these are the trees you want to take. You usually want to leave some of the extremely mature trees, because those are the ones that are reproducing every year and dropping, the seedlings and the acorns and things like that. So you don't want to take all your big mature trees, because on a mountainside, like most of the hardwoods, they kind of self-populate. With pine, you plant. When my parents used to log their pine, they'd cut it, and then they'd have to replant it, and then you'd wait 30 more years, for it to harvest it again. But with like mountain kind of land and a lot of the hardwoods, they self-propagate, and
Interesting.
kind of stuff. So you leave a few of the bigger trees to keep that cycle going.
Is there anything where you show up and you look at the land and you're like, no, no.
Access, one,
Access. Okay.
yeah. So you have to keep in mind when you're looking at a piece of land, you and you settle on a logging company to log it. They've got to get to it.
Yeah.
Some of my land that I've purchased, there's been many places we can log, but then you're driving through some of the old logging roads that they cut in from the 50s, and you look down 100 feet down into a valley, and there's gigantic mature trees, but it just wouldn't be worthwhile for the logging company to go down there and try to pull those out or send their guys down in there. So
Sure.
you need access. With the logging company too, the logging companies don't care about your land. All they care about is getting the trees out. So they'll go in and just destroy your land, from taking big dozers in and D9s and, all kinds of stuff, just screwing your land all to pieces. So the logging company I have that I use, they're out of North Carolina, and they come over to Tennessee. But one thing that I also looked for, they don't just take the straight piece of timber. Most logging companies will take the straight piece of timber, and then they'll leave the tops. Just, you have to deal with the tops. They're just tops of the trees. So the company I kind of settled on is they even will grind up and into pulp all the tops, and then I sell the pulp to they buy the pulp from me as well at certain amount per ton of pulp I get as well. So they take the full tree. So it leaves a cleaner space,
Yeah.
and I don't have all these treetops all laying over the place, and looks like a nuclear bomb hit the land, and and
What's pulp used for? Paper?
yeah, paper. You can use it for paper. Sometimes mulch.
Okay.
Yeah, all kinds of stuff they can grind it up in.
So what I really love about that is that I'm all about, when I do a transaction, I want every revenue stream that I can get
Yeah.
out of that transaction, right?
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
it is, when you look at that and you say, okay, great, how much of the tree are we going to use? Well, we're just going to take the pretty part. It's like,
Mhm.
that doesn't really
Right.
suit me.
Right.
And so because I haven't been a logger, because I'm not an actual real lumberjack,
Right.
are you leaving behind like a bunch of stumps, or is that what the D9's for, to basically rip those things
That's
out?
what, yeah. So I own all my own Caterpillar equipment. Just from a development standpoint, I used to subcontract that out. But an excavator charges, $300 an hour.
Holy
And
cow, yeah.
when you're talking hundreds of acres of excavation, that adds up. So what I did was I went out and purchased all Caterpillar, excavators, bulldozers, skid steers. So I own all that. And so we can go in with the D9 or the D7 or the 299, and pull up the roots and things like that, and then do whatever we want to with them.
Do you get any use out of those? Do you
Yeah,
get use?
some people. So some people in the Southeast, and one in particular, like the Amish community,
Okay.
will buy those off of you, and they make kind of ornate tabletops off of the
Okay.
root system, things like that. They have the sanding equipment and poly equipment, to kind of put the polyurethane on top of it to make just a big ornate kind of country looking table.
Really? Yeah. Because I've seen some of that stuff. And yeah, you kind of look at nature differently when you see and a craftsman differently. When it's like, that was just a tree stump we turned upside down and we cleaned,
Right.
and then we
Sanded
polished
it down on both sides, and now it's a pretty sweet looking table.
exactly. And you're like, and it costs how much again?
Yeah,
But yeah,
exactly.
totally seeing that too. But the craftsmen are absolutely fantastic. My uncle Ed is actually a horse crematorium.
Oh, wow.
And
Wow.
so it's a thing. I was
Wow.
like, you're gonna do what? And he's like, yeah. I'm like, all right. And he's actually doing that in Tennessee.
Really?
Yeah. And he actually has the Amish build his beautiful chests that and urns for these horses
No
that
way.
get
No way.
cremated. Yeah.
Wow.
The,
That's crazy.
I said to him, I go, well, if I haven't heard it all now, I don't know when I will.
That's pretty awesome. That's pretty awesome.
But yeah, he loves it. And he's like, it's a great service. He's like,
Yeah.
a lot of these horses are loved more than the family.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
he's like, I want to make sure it's a great,
That is crazy.
experience.
That is
And so,
crazy.
yeah, I'm just like, it's just like, I tease him. I'm like, you're an undertaker. He goes, I have nothing to do with it. He goes, I'm just there to make sure it's a good experience. But I'm trying to think. Yeah, go ahead.
Before I forget,
Yeah.
one of the other things I do with the land a lot of times is, as soon as I buy it, a lot of states will have like a green belt kind of law that they have. So with the green belt, you can declare it as forestry land or ag land, and you cut your taxes by, probably 100 times. I mean, you reduce your taxes to pretty much nothing. And so with the land, if I'm not going to immediately develop it, I'll declare it as green belt, and I'll have a forestry person come in, pay them a few $100s, do a timber study and forestry study, and say, okay, this is where we're going to log. Then turn it over to the county, county assessor's office, and it's called rollback taxes. They drop your taxes almost by like 80%, 80 to 90% on what the value is. So people think you're going to buy land. People that have never done land before think you buy land and you're going to just have, almost like you're buying a lot in a residential neighborhood, you're going to have to pay these taxes on it. But with agricultural land or farmland or forestry land, you pay hardly no taxes at all.
Wow. And so then when you're doing that, then you really have almost no carry costs.
No expense. No. In fact, I have so little expense. I pay one of the local guys that lives at the bottom of the land to kind of maintain the road. There's some land that I've purchased had old logging roads in it from when it was logged back in the 50s and 60s. So over 40 years, 50 years, there was a lot of little trees that had grown up and rocks that had fallen. So, I have no expense really with taxes or anything like, so I pay this guy, he's an expense, but I pay him to kind of go cut through, to give me access, pretty easy, to some of the roads on the side by side or four wheeler, just so I can kind of explore it, or take some of the logging guys with me and show them what's up at the top of the mountain or something like that.
I like nothing better than talking to other investors who are elite at something and really dialed in. So
after the 2008 crash, I don't ever want to consider myself elite at real estate. After what I went through in 2008, 2009 time period, I've become conservative, and it's, the doors have just opened up with the land. And it's funny, like, as you get older, you think about the stuff your parents used to tell you that turned out you thought they were full of crap, and then it's like they were actually onto something with this.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fascinating. It was funny because really I only started looking at land maybe a year or two ago. And it was more just because if I have a couple hundred acres, I can do whatever I want with it. Like just to be able to, and it's like, that's my land, that's generational land. 100%. Or if it grows to 500 or 700 or 1,000 acres, and then it's something where generationally that stuff can get passed down. Like, and then the opportunity to, those resources are only getting harder and harder to find. And then correct me if I'm wrong, usually the older the trees, the more valuable the trees, if you can get to them.
Generally speaking, and with trees and any kind of timber, you do want to log it. They're kind of, you get to the state of no return where
too big.
You start to have risk when the trees get really, if a fire comes through, if a heavy rain comes through and the root system gets loose and it falls over, and dies that way. So there is a point where you do want to, log the stuff.
Is that like kind of a rule of thumb? Like if like a 30, if I'm finding 30 to 40 years, this is good. And if I'm finding that the stuff is 50 years old, that's now we're starting.
No, I mean, it's good. It's great. You could have some serious, straight, mature trees at 50 years old and even a lot older than that. The key is with land, before you buy anything, call the county. The county always has a forestry division. A lot of times the forester at the county could meet you out at the property and tell you what he thinks. A lot of times he'll know the history of the property, number one. But he can also meet you out at the property and look at it and see, kind of, okay, is there any value in logging this? One thing I've noticed too, with the more land I acquire, and I didn't really get this in real estate until I started getting into land, but land definitely equals power. You can have, if you're in any county in America, you can have a $10 million house on a big lot. And then a guy next to you can have 2,000 acres that's worth $10 million. Who do you think's got more power? And I don't want to say power, but influence at the county level.
It's going to be the land guy for sure.
Same value. This 5-acre gigantic mansion that's worth 10 million. This 2,000 acres that's worth 10 million right down the road. That guy with the 2,000 acres has a lot more influence in the county than the guy with the $10 million single family house. So one thing I've noticed once I started really getting into mass land acquisition was the power and the influence that it comes with. I've got mayors wanting to meet, and talk to me about the plans, like city planning, wanting to talk. Tax incentive. There's a lot of tax incentives with states. But you see these guys like, Bill Gates and I'm nowhere near like their level, but you see that there's a reason those guys acquire mass amounts of land. So
I'd prefer you to have that land instead of my buddy Bill. He scares me. He scares me just a little bit with what I think he might do with that land. But yeah, I think it's absolutely fascinating. What's the one thing if somebody's starting to look at and think about land or starting to dream big, what's the one thing that you'd tell that person about land?
Um, be careful with it
Yeah.
because it does not produce rental income like a long-term rental or short-term rental. So if you're leveraging to the hilt to buy a piece of land, I would not advise that. You're
Right.
not going to get the immediate cash flow like a long-term rental or short-term rental or a commercial property would give you. You know, so there's massive amounts of money to be made in land, but would I make that my first entrance into real estate? No.
Yeah.
I'd look for something that cash flows,
Yeah.
like a single family dwelling or a duplex or something like that first. Let that be kind of your foray into real estate, and then once you have a good sizable cash flow, then kind of start dabbling in land, because land can backfire and you can get a big piece and it not produce anything. You don't have any cash flow coming in from it. You can't log it. You can't get any rocks from it. You bought the wrong piece. You got to sell for a loss. So it is, you really have to learn it,
Yeah.
and the only way you learn it sometimes is to buy a bad piece, and then you're like, okay, I messed up on here. Let me buy this piece. And then you kind of can get going with it.
That's awesome. Well, Matt, you've been super gracious with all your time. I really appreciate it. Guys, I really want to thank Matt for taking the time to do this with us. We actually just met on social media and I was just like, I got to know more. Super cool guy doing some really awesome stuff. Make sure that if you have questions, just put them in the video below. I'm sure I'll send Matt a link so you can see the kind of questions being asked. I'm sure he'll give us some information back. And when I start on my land journey, I can promise you I will be reaching out to Matt Peterson.
Good.
So
All
Matt,
right.
thank you so much for all your time. I look forward to doing this again with you soon.
Thanks for having me.
I appreciate you guys. Thanks so much. Make sure to give him a like and a thumbs up when you go in there in the comments and ask some good questions, because I think he gave us a lot of good information. I'm even more excited about my opportunity for
And I'm on Twitter. Too.
Please. Yeah.
Southern Land DEV.
Southern Land DEV.
DEV.
Yeah. On Twitter.
Yep.
Awesome. Yeah, absolutely. Reach out there. Matt, thanks so much for the time. We'll talk again soon.
See you.